Today. Today, we're partly talking about religion, Catholicism. The Religious Renaissance is the official title of the chapter, and the imposition of Catholicism in the Americas. As we saw in the film and throughout, the idea of conversion. The Portuguese were doing this with their enslaved Africans on the coast of Africa. The Spanish were trying to do it too. It really was a huge part of the colonial enterprise, for better or worse. And so in today's world, when people look at Latin America and say it's very Catholic, that is, a result of this. They were serious about this, and this was one of the primary missions and justifications for other things that would go on under colonialism. It is also curious, or it might seem curious to us, that some of these missions became very wealthy. They would maybe get an inheritance from somebody who is hoping to save their soul. There's a whole system here, as they talk about, of people kind of sponsoring churches or convents in the hopes of getting out of purgatory. That was another way you could move up in the world, is by giving money to the church. Not only that, but they were able to have their own enterprises. As you saw in the film, there was a Jesuit-run plantation. This was fairly common to have the churches in charge of plantations. On page 211, it says that some of the missions grew wealthy, and I think some people said that these accused them of being places where they were just, tax-free businesses. In general, as they said, these places were probably less oppressive than being on a privately owned plantation. They could be. There were some cases in which the church actually did own enslaved people, enslaved Africans. So they did have a lot of economic power, and they were threatening to some of the business interests. So different countries in Latin America have, for example, Ecuador kicked out the Jesuit order. They expelled them from the country because they were becoming too powerful and wealthy and challenging other authorities. We here in the United States say that, we have this whole thing that at least some of us believe that the church and state are supposed to be separate. But in Latin America, the Catholic Church and the state are, as they put it, two sides of the same coin. And there's a real overlap. If you travel in or live in Latin America today, there's often an overlap between the church boundaries, the neighborhood boundaries, and the school boundaries, which are often, the schools were often, and still to this day, are often run by the Catholic Church. And so you wouldn't see this as you would learn about Catholicism in school. That would be one of the primary reasons that you went to school. So there's this overlap between church and state, which may seem unusual, but is very powerful in some of these areas, and was a central part of colonial rule. Two of you cited this quote and said it was confusing. So I think to explain this quote has to do with the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition. And before we tackle this one, I think if we go back one sentence from there, true believers, like gemstones, were difficult to judge. So I guess I would say that, the phrase innocent until proven guilty. In Christianity in general, and probably Catholicism in particular, we're all guilty. we've all sinned. We're all sinners. And if we haven't sinned, we are fallible sinners. That means we're liable to fall into sin, or we could always be falling into sin. And so in some senses, Christianity assumes that you are guilty and you never really can be proven innocent. You can only be proven innocent by in the Protestant case, you know, repenting and having God forgive your sins. In the Catholic case, going into the confessional and confessing your sins. And so in the Inquisition, everyone had their opinions, and all Baroque Catholics from this time period, regardless of how much money you had, education, your gender, or your skin color, you could be accused of being a witch or being a deviant of some sort. And the Inquisition basically worked on people accusing each other. So if you didn't have too many enemies, you were in good shape, but you could always turn somebody in, and then they'd bring you in, and then they just sit there and they say, "Do you have anything to confess?" Some people would tell them more than they needed to know. Others could get out of this. So it was pretty, it was at one and the same time a very harsh regime, but as they say, a lot of things happened on the edges and outside of this system. Not everybody fell into this. It brings up, though, an interesting factor that continues in modern life. Spain is, they're now the world's biggest exporter of pork, but they love pork in Spain. They're one of the biggest per capita consumers of pork. Latin America, they don't consume as much, but it's very prized. It's a very prized thing to be able to eat pork and have some sort of meal that involves pork in it. It's a great thing to do, a wonderful thing to do. Why might it be a good idea to demonstrate how much you love pork if you lived in Spain? The Jews and the Muslims don't eat pork. And so what are you saying if you're just pouring on the pork? What are you declaring about yourself? Yeah, I mean, it's a good way to prove that you're Catholic. And in fact, if you don't eat pork, on page 218 to 219, neighbors reported on anyone performing unusual rituals such as lighting candles or fasting outside Catholic feast days, or even for not eating pork. So if you don't eat pork, you're like, maybe they're hiding something. Maybe they're, maybe they're a secret Jew. Maybe they're a secret Muslim. Maybe they're not a true Christian. So it's a good way to prove, to this day, one of the highest pork consumptions in the world. It becomes a tradition. So, this is part of the Inquisition, is learning to love pork. The big point of this chapter, I think, though, is that although you have this overarching, very fearsome Inquisition, and although you have the attempted imposition of Catholicism and conversion and all these things, is that what you end up with is lots of what they call local forms of Christianity, or local forms of Catholicism. And so just to give you the quote, which I think is perhaps the most important part of this chapter, it leads to the creation of scores, perhaps hundreds of distinct local forms of Christianity, each one reflecting the African and/or Native American culture of its creators. So this is not, I mean, obviously there's a wide scale spread and promotion of Catholicism, but they say it's not uniform, in the sense that it's not one thing that gets imposed on everybody. And it's also not by nation. It's really by these distinct local forms in each little place where people would embrace, reject, transform, take it on, do their own thing with it. So, like I said, although we refer to Latin America today as Catholic countries, the prevalence of these kinds of local Catholicisms is very important. Now, one of the funny things, or one of the reasons why perhaps this was so localized, is that the first thing the Spanish did, at least, this didn't happen as much in Brazil, but in especially in places like the Maya area and the Aztec area and the Inca area, where there were pre-existing temples and building sites. Basically, they either, maybe demolish the old one, but use the same place, often use the same stones in order to build a church. Now, on the one hand, this is a great way of showing that you're in charge. You've built a church on a pre-existing holy site. But on the other hand, right, this is a validation of what was going on at the time, right? Or it could be considered to be a validation of, oh, we're just doing the same thing. We're just calling it Catholic now. There's an effectiveness to it. It could also make people mad, and there were rebellions and stuff against this. But yeah, just before you came in, I gave them this quote, which was about, that although there's Catholicism in general, it gets adapted in each local way. And each of these people who's building a church is like, I mean, the chapter starts with that example of that person who's like, yeah, I think I'll donate to a church, and hopefully in the meantime be able to pass my inheritance on to a female heir, which was technically illegal, and also, get out of being in purgatory, which nobody wants to be in purgatory. So I was looking for around. This is one of the examples that they gave. One of the more beautiful Inca temples in Cusco, the Coricancha, served as the base for the less elegant church of Santo Domingo. So you can kind of maybe see you have the Inca, some of the Inca stones and maybe even the stone work is still in the base of that church. And then they made a less elegant church on top of it, but probably the reason why it's so, the Inca architecture was amazingly earthquake resistant because it fit those stones together. Spanish architecture, not so much, but there it is. Pretty nice.